The ink was still wet on the parchment when Sarah pressed it against her tongue, and the taste hit her like iron, filings dissolved in vinegar, sharp enough to make her eyes water, bitter enough to coat the back of her throat in something that felt like swallowing a bruise. She had been on her knees scrubbing the stone floor of the council hall when they brought the decree in. 3 elders walked in a line, their ceremonial robes dragging across the wet flagstones she had just cleaned. Leaving grey smears, she would have to scrub again. Elder Harmon carried the scroll. Elder Yun carried the seal. Elder Kess carried nothing but her permanent expression of mild disgust, which she directed at Sarah. The way a person might glance at a stain on an otherwise clean tablecloth. Sarah knew what the scroll was before they unrolled it. She had been copying documents in the records hall since she was 11 years old. That was her job. Not a glamorous one. Not a powerful one. She was the Thornmere Pack's record keeper, which meant she spent her days hunched over a desk copying birth certificates, death notices, land transfers, and disciplinary rulings in her careful, slanted handwriting. Her fingertips were permanently stained blue-black. The skin between her thumb and forefinger had a callus so thick it had cracked and bled last winter, and she had wrapped it in a strip torn from her own pillowcase because the pack healer said she was not worth the salve. She knew the scroll was an exile decree because of the red wax. Red for exile, black for death, green for territory disputes. She had catalogued thousands of them, and she knew whose name was on it, because Elder Harmon's hands were trembling. Harmon was 73 years old. He had signed her mother's death certificate. He had signed the paperwork that stripped Sarah of her family's cottage and reassigned it to Beta Corwin's 3rd son, who wanted a hunting lodge near the eastern ridge. Harmon had never trembled signing anything. But Harmon had known her mother, and whatever was left of his conscience, buried under decades of pack politics and cowardice, apparently still twitched when he was about to exile that woman's only daughter. Sarah did not think about what she did next. Her body moved before her mind could stop it. She dropped the scrub brush, lunged forward on her knees, and snatched the parchment from the elder's hand with a speed that should not have been possible for someone who had eaten nothing but half a bowl of cold oat porridge in the last 2 days. The scroll was thick, good quality, the kind they used for formal pronouncements. It tasted of lye and animal fat, and the particular metallic bitterness of freshly mixed oak gall ink. She bit down, tore a strip free with her teeth, and swallowed. The elders stared at her. She swallowed again, her throat working against the fibrous lump, and bit off another piece. The name. She had to eat the name. If the decree was never formally read before the council, if the name was never spoken into the official record, it could not be enacted. That was old law. Pack law from before the regional codes were standardized. She had read about it in a water-damaged ledger from 1847 that nobody else had bothered to open in decades. "Stop her," Elder Kess said, but her voice was flat, more annoyed than alarmed, like she was asking someone to stop a dog from eating table scraps. Sarah swallowed to the 3rd piece. She could feel the ink dissolving against the soft tissue of her throat, leaving a chemical sting that would hurt for days. She gagged, pressed her fist against her mouth, and forced the paper down. The name was gone. The decree was a ragged rectangle with a hole in the center where the condemned wolf's name had been. Beta Corwin entered the hall through the side door. He was a big man, not tall but wide, with a neck like a tree stump and small eyes that sat too close together above a nose that had been broken so many times it had a permanent leftward lean. He smelled like leather polish and the cheap pine soap the warriors used, and underneath that, the sour musk of someone who enjoyed being angry. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. Corwin never asked questions. He issued statements that happened to lack information. The Omega ate the decree, Elder Yun said. Yun was the youngest of the three, barely 50, with a thin mouth and a habit of stating facts without editorializing. Sarah had always appreciated that about him. He never added cruelty to his neutral observations the way the others did. Corwin looked at Sarah. She was still on her knees. Her mouth was stained dark blue. A thread of saliva and ink hung from her lower lip. Her stomach was clenching around the wad of parchment like a fist. "Whose name was on it?" Corwin asked. "Hers," Kess said. Corwin's expression did not change. He reached down, grabbed Sarah by the front of her linen work shirt, and hauled her to her feet. The fabric pulled tight against the back of her neck, and she felt the collar button pop free and skitter across the stone floor. "You think eating paper changes anything?" He held her close enough that she could see the individual pores on his nose, the tiny broken capillaries on his cheeks. His breath was stale coffee and smoked venison. "I will write another decree. I will write 10. You cannot eat them all." "You can write them," Sarah said. Her voice came out raw, scraped thin by the parchment she had forced down. "But elder law requires the original decree to be read before the full council. A copy has no legal standing unless the original is also presented. Section 14, subsection 8 of the Founding Accords." Corwin stared at her. "I read it in the 1847 ledger," she added, because she could not help herself. "Third shelf, north wall, behind the tax records." He dropped her. She hit the floor hard enough that her knees would be purple by evening, and she felt the impact travel up through her hip bones and rattle her spine. "Lock her in the records room," Corwin said to no one in particular. "I will deal with this after the Alpha King's delegation arrives." That was when the air in the room changed. Sarah had never met the Alpha King. Nobody in Thornmere had. Their pack was small, barely 200 wolves, tucked into a river valley in the northern reaches where the forest grew so thick that sunlight only hit the ground in coins and slivers. The Alpha King ruled from the Central Territory, 3 days' travel south, and his name was spoken the way people in small towns speak about hurricanes. Distant, inevitable, something that happened to other places. But today, apparently, the hurricane was coming here. 2 warriors dragged Sarah to the records room and shoved her inside. The door was heavy oak with an iron bolt on the outside, and it closed with a sound like a coffin lid. The room was familiar. She had spent more hours here than anywhere else in her life. It smelled like dust and old leather, and the faintly sweet decay of paper, breaking down over decades. Her desk was in the corner, a scarred wooden table with one leg shorter than the others, propped level with a folded piece of cardboard she had cut from a supply box 3 years ago. Her ink bottles were lined up in a row. Her pens were clean, nibs down in a ceramic cup she had found in the kitchen discard pile and repaired with a strip of tape. She sat in her chair and pressed her hand against her stomach. The parchment was a hard lump under her ribs, and every time she breathed, she could taste the ink at the back of her throat. The flavor had settled into something almost familiar. Not just oak gall and iron sulfate, the standard recipe. There was something else, something that made the inside of her mouth tingle, something that raised the fine hairs on her forearms. She had tasted that ingredient once before, in her mother's workshop years ago, before the fire. Her mother had kept a small ceramic pot on the highest shelf, sealed with beeswax and marked with a symbol Sarah had never seen in any of the books she catalogued. Her mother had been a healer, the real kind, not the pack healer who rationed salve based on rank. Her mother had understood plants the way some people understood music, instinctively and completely. and she had mixed medicines that worked in ways that made the pack uneasy. That uneasiness had eventually killed her, but that was a different story, and Sarah did not have time for it now. She could hear boots in the corridor. Many boots. The particular heavy-soled military stride of warriors who trained in formation. And underneath the sound of boots, something else. A vibration, not quite audible, more felt than heard, like standing too close to a power line. It hummed in her teeth and settled into her sternum. Her wolf stirred. That was the thing nobody knew about Sarah. They called her wolfless. They had since she was 14 and failed her first shift, kneeling in the moonlight while the other adolescents transformed around her, bones cracking, skin splitting, fur pushing through in dark waves. Sarah had knelt there and felt nothing. Her wolf had not come. Beta Corwin had declared her defective, an Omega without a wolf. The lowest possible status, barely above a human, useful only for manual labor and paperwork. But Sarah's wolf was not absent. Sarah's wolf was hiding. She had felt it for the first time 2 years ago, a flicker of warmth behind her breastbone, like a candle flame in a drafty room. It came when she was afraid. It came when she was angry, and it came now, pressing against the inside of her ribs with a pressure that was almost painful, responding to that vibration in the air, the way a tuning fork responds to its matching note. The bolt on the door slid back. She expected Corwin, or one of his warriors. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a man she had never seen before, and her wolf did not just stir. It lunged. The sensation was so sudden and so violent that Sarah gasped and doubled forward in her chair. Heat flooded her chest, her throat, her face. Her vision blurred and refocused with a sharpness that frightened her. She could suddenly see details she should not have been able to see from across the room. The individual stitches in the man's collar. A faded scar along the left side of his jaw, thin and white, disappearing under his ear. The texture of his skin, where the scar tissue met the smooth skin of his neck. He was tall, not in the ordinary way that tall men are tall, where you notice it and move on. He was tall in a way that reorganized the room around him. The doorframe, which Sarah walked through without thinking every day, looked like it had been built to a smaller scale. His shoulders filled the space wall to wall. He wore black, simple clothing that looked expensive because of the way it fit, not because of any visible embellishment. His hair was dark, almost black, cut shorter on the sides and longer on top, and it had the kind of natural disarray that suggested he had recently been running his hands through it. But it was his eyes that made Sarah's wolf slam against her ribcage, hard enough to crack a barrier she had held for 9 years. They were amber. Not brown with a golden tinge amber. Actual amber. The deep, resinous gold of fossilized tree sap, with darker striations radiating from the pupil. And they were fixed on her, with an intensity that made every nerve ending in her body fire simultaneously. He inhaled. His nostrils flared. His pupils dilated so rapidly that the amber was swallowed to a thin ring around black. "Mate," he said. The word was not a statement. It was a sound pulled from somewhere below language, from the base of his throat, from the wolf inside him that was so close to the surface she could see it in the way the muscles of his jaw tightened and the tendons in his neck stood rigid. Sarah pressed herself back in her chair. The wooden slats dug into her spine. Her heart was hammering so fast, the individual beats had merged into a continuous buzz. She could smell him, cedar and wood smoke, and something dark and sweet underneath, like blackberries crushed between warm fingers. The scent filled the small records room and settled over the familiar dust and leather smell like a wave covering footprints on a beach. "You have ink on your mouth," he said. His voice had shifted, still deep, still resonant, but there was something almost bewildered in it now, as if he had walked into a room expecting a diplomatic meeting and found instead something he had been searching for his entire life. Sarah touched her lips. Her fingertips came away stained blue-black. She probably looked insane. Kneeling on a wet floor, paper eating, ink-stained insane. "Who are you?" she asked. "Kyle Voss," he said. "Alpha King of the Central Territories." She almost laughed. The sound caught in her throat and came out as a small, strangled noise that could have been a sob or a hiccup. Of course. Of course the Alpha King himself had walked into her cramped records room in the armpit of nowhere while she had a belly full of parchment and ink running down her chin. This was exactly the kind of cosmic joke the universe enjoyed playing on Sarah Thorne. "Why did you eat paper?" he asked. He had not moved from the doorway. His body was rigid with the kind of controlled stillness she recognized from descriptions in the old texts. The stillness of an alpha holding his wolf back from doing what instinct demanded. Claiming. Marking. Taking. "It was an exile decree," she said, "with my name on it." Something shifted in his expression. The bewilderment hardened into something else, something that looked like the moment before lightning strikes, when the air goes metallic and the hair on your arms rises. "Who ordered your exile?" "Beta Corwin. He has been leading the pack since our Alpha died 4 years ago. No one challenged for the position. Corwin made himself de facto Alpha and has been ruling by committee. The Elders sign whatever he puts in front of them." Kyle Voss looked at the small room. She watched his eyes move over the stacks of ledgers, the patched chair, the desk with its cardboard shim. He looked at the single window, barely wider than his forearm, that let in a strip of grey light. He looked at the thin blanket folded on the bottom shelf, the one she slept under when Corwin locked her in here overnight as punishment for imagined infractions. "You sleep here," he said. "Sometimes. This is a storage room." "I am aware." He took one step into the room, and the temperature changed, not figuratively. Sarah felt actual warmth radiating off him, as if his body ran several degrees hotter than a normal wolf's. The heat reached her face first, then her hands, and her fingers, which had been stiff and cold from the wet floor, began to ache as sensation returned. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly. Can you do that?" She nodded. Her wolf was pressing against her chest wall so hard she was finding it difficult to breathe. "Do you feel it?" She knew what he meant. The pull. The thread of something that ran between them, invisible and insistent, like a fishing line hooked under her sternum and reeling her forward. "Yes," she said. "Do you know what it means?" "I am a record keeper. I have catalogued 642 mate bond registrations. I know what it means." Something happened to his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that he caught before it fully formed. It made him look younger, less like a weapon, and more like a person. "Then you know I cannot leave this room without you." "You are the Alpha King," she said. "You can do whatever you want." "That is precisely the problem." He extended his hand. His palm was calloused, with a ridge of thickened skin along the outer edge that came from years of sword work. There was a thin cut across his index finger. Fresh. Only hours old. The kind of small wound you get from a sharp edge of paper. Paper. Sarah looked at his hand, looked at the cut, looked at his face. "You opened the exile decree before the Elders did," she said. "You read it first." He did not deny it. You came to this room because you already knew my name. I came to this room, he said, because when I touched that parchment, my wolf nearly tore through my skin. The ink. There was something in the ink. Something that smelled like me, Sarah said. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the amber was brighter, almost luminous, and the dark striations had spread. His wolf was so close to the surface that Sarah could almost see it, a shadow moving behind his eyes. You, he confirmed. Sarah's mind worked fast. It always had. Corwin called it her one useful trait, her ability to process information and find patterns. And the pattern here was clear. Her mother had been a healer. Her mother had made the ink that the pack used for official documents, a tradition going back generations, recipes passed from healer to healer. After her mother died, Sarah had taken over ink production because nobody else knew how. She followed her mother's recipes, mixed the oak gall and iron sulfate and gum arabic, and added the contents of that mysterious ceramic pot from the highest shelf, because the recipe said to add it, and Sarah followed recipes. She had been putting her own essence into the ink for years, not literally, or maybe literally. She did not fully understand it yet. But whatever was in that ceramic pot, whatever her mother had been distilling and sealing with beeswax and marking with that unknown symbol, it carried something. A signature. A trace of the bloodline. And the Alpha King had tasted it when he touched the parchment. Come with me, Kael said. His hand was still extended. I cannot. Corwin will write another decree. He will exile me before the council can convene. Corwin, Kael said, and the name in his mouth sounded like a death sentence, does not have the authority to exile anyone. He is not Alpha. He was never confirmed by the crown. His edicts are administrative theatre. He does not know that. He is about to learn. Sarah took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and the contact sent a jolt of sensation up her arm and into her chest, where her wolf rose to meet it like a flame meeting oxygen. She felt something shift inside her, a deep tectonic movement in a place she had thought was permanently sealed. Her wolf was not just stirring now. It was waking up. They walked through the corridor. Sarah was acutely aware of how she must look. Thin, ink-stained, wearing a work shirt with a missing button and trousers with scrub water soaked into the knees. Her hair was pulled back in a knot that had loosened during the struggle with the decree, and dark strands hung around her face. Her hands were chapped and rough. There was a scar along the inside of her left forearm from a scalding accident in the kitchen 3 years ago, raised and shiny, a track of melted-looking skin from wrist to elbow. Kael walked beside her, and his hand did not leave hers. He matched his stride to her shorter one, and she noticed that his body angled slightly toward her, even as he walked forward, as if some part of him was physically incapable of not orienting in her direction. The council hall was full. Corwin stood at the head of the long stone table, flanked by his warriors. The 3 elders sat in their carved chairs, and along the walls, standing in the rigid attention of soldiers on formal duty, were Kael's own warriors, the king's guard, 12 of them, each wearing the black and silver insignia of the Central Territories. Every head turned when Kael entered with Sarah. Corwin's face went through several changes in quick succession. Confusion, recognition, and then a slow, careful blankness that Sarah had seen before. The expression he wore when he was calculating how to turn a situation to his advantage. Alpha King, Corwin said. He inclined his head in the shallow bow of a man who resented the gesture. We were not expecting you in the records wing. I hope our Omega was not troubling you. She was not troubling me, Kael said. She was educating me. He released Sarah's hand and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a piece of parchment, identical in size and quality to the Exile decree Sarah had eaten. But this one was intact. It was the decree. Sarah's stomach dropped. A second copy. Corwin had prepared a second copy. "This is interesting," Kael said, holding the document up. An Exile decree from an unauthorized acting beta, bearing a council seal that was applied improperly, with the wrong color wax, to a document that references Section 12 of the PAC Charter, which was voided in 1963 by the Territorial Reformation Act. He looked at Sarah. "Did I miss anything?" Sarah stared at him. She had not told him any of that. She had not mentioned the wax color, the charter reference, or the Reformation Act. He had read the decree once, briefly, and identified every procedural error in it. "The witness signatures are also out of order," she said. "Elder Yun signed before Elder Harmon, but Harmon holds seniority. The document is technically unsigned." Kael looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long, and the corner of his mouth moved again in that almost smile. "The document is technically unsigned," he repeated, and something in his voice suggested he was memorizing the way she said it. Corwin's blankness cracked. "The Omega has no standing to comment on legal procedures. She is wolfless. By PAC law, she cannot participate in council proceedings." "She is not wolfless," Kael said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Sarah could feel it pressing against her eardrums. "She is," Corwin said, but his voice had lost its conviction. He was looking at Sarah now, and for the first time in 9 years, Sarah saw something other than dismissal in his eyes. She saw uncertainty. Kael turned to Sarah. "May I?" he asked, and the gentleness in the question was so at odds with the rest of him, with the military bearing and the predator's eyes and the body that looked like it had been built to break things, that Sarah almost flinched. "May you what?" "Call your wolf." She wanted to say she did not have a wolf to call. That was the reflex, the habit of 9 years. But the warmth in her chest was undeniable now, a living heat that pulsed in time with her heartbeat, and responded to Kael's proximity like iron filings responding to a magnet. "I do not know if it will work," she said. "It will work." He stepped closer. He was near enough now that she had to tilt her head back to see his face, and the scent of cedar and wood smoke and dark berries was so strong it was almost a physical substance, something she could lean into. He raised his hand and placed it flat against her sternum, palm down, fingers spread. The heat of his hand soaked through her thin shirt and into her skin and down into the place where her wolf lived, and her wolf answered. The shift was not like the shifts she had witnessed at 14, the violent, bone-cracking transformations of adolescent wolves forcing their way out. This was different. This was a door opening from the inside. Sarah felt it as a warm expansion, a blooming sensation that started where Kael's hand pressed against her chest and radiated outward like light through stained glass. Her vision sharpened, her hearing opened up. She could suddenly hear the heartbeats of every person in the room, each one a distinct rhythm, Corwin's fast and thready, Harmon's slow and heavy, Kael's deep and steady as a war drum. She did not fully shift, but her eyes changed. She felt it happen, a tingling heat behind her eyeballs, and from the way Elder Harmon's mouth fell open and Corwin took a step backward, she knew the color had changed too. "Silver," Kael said quietly. He was looking at her eyes the way a person looks at something they have been told exists, but never expected to see. "Your wolf's eyes are silver." Sarah did not know what that meant, but Corwin did. She could see it in the way the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of cold candle wax. "That is not possible," Corwin said. "And yet," Kyle said, not taking his eyes off Sarah, "here she is." Silver-eyed wolves. Sarah had read about them. They appeared in the oldest records, the ones she had found in the water-damaged ledgers that nobody else bothered to read. Silver eyes indicated lunar bloodline, the original bloodline, the one that predated the modern pack structure. The founding line. The wolves who had written the Accords. She was not an Omega. She was not even a regular pack wolf. She was a direct descendant of the original Lunas, and her wolf had been hiding for 9 years, dormant, waiting for something strong enough to wake it up. "My mother knew," Sarah said. The realization hit her like a physical blow, a punch to the soft tissue of understanding that left her breathless. That is what was in the ink. The ceramic pot. She was distilling something from our bloodline, incorporating it into the ceremonial ink. Every decree, every birth certificate, every death notice this pack has produced for the last 3 decades carries our family's signature. "Your mother was wise," Kyle said. "She hid the evidence in plain sight." "She hid me," Sarah corrected. "She suppressed my wolf to protect me, because she knew that if Corwin found out what I was, he would not exile me. He would kill me." Every eye in the room turned to Corwin, and this was the moment Sarah expected him to bluster, to deny, to puff up with the righteous indignation of a man accused of something he absolutely did. That was what villains did in the stories she read in the old books. They denied and they postured, and they were dragged down in the end. But Corwin did something she did not expect. He sat down. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the Alpha's chair that he had no right to occupy, and he sat down heavily, and he put his hands flat on the table, and he looked at them. His thick fingers, his scarred knuckles, the wedding band on his left hand, a plain silver ring that his wife had given him before she died in the border skirmish 8 years ago. "Her mother came to me before the fire," Corwin said. His voice was flat, tired. "She told me what the girl was. She asked me to protect her. She said the pack would need a lunar bloodline wolf when the old alliances failed." He looked up, and his small eyes were wet in a way that looked wrong on his brutish face, like finding a pressed flower inside a brick. "I said no. I told her the pack did not need old magic. I told her to leave. She left. The fire happened 3 weeks later. I have wondered every day since whether I could have stopped it." The room was silent. "You still tried to exile her daughter," Kyle said. His voice was ice. "I tried to get her out before the regional summit," Corwin said, "because I knew if the other packs discovered what she was, they would try to take her. I was not protecting her from myself. I was protecting her from everyone else." He paused. "I did it badly. I know that." "You did it in a way that caused her 9 years of suffering," Kyle said. "Yes. You called her defective. You took her family's home. You locked her in a storage room. Yes. Because you were afraid." Corwin looked at Kyle, and in his small, wet eyes, Sarah saw something she had never seen there before. Not guilt, exactly. Guilt implies the capacity for moral self-reflection, and Sarah was not sure Corwin had that. What she saw was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had been holding a position he was not built for, making decisions he was not equipped to make, and watching the consequences accumulate like snow on a roof that was already sagging. "I was afraid," Corwin said. Kyle did not forgive him. That was not the kind of thing you forgive. But something in the set of his jaw loosened, almost imperceptibly, the way a bowstring relaxes by a fraction of an inch after the arrow has already been released. He turned to Sarah, You are coming with me to the Central Territories. Tonight." "I have not agreed to anything," Sarah said. The almost smile appeared again, and this time it was closer to a full expression. "You ate a legal document to protect yourself. You cited a law from 1847 to a man twice your size. You have ink on your tongue and parchment in your stomach, and your wolf's eyes are the color of moonlight. You are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I am not going to pretend that walking away from you is something I am capable of doing." "That is very eloquent," Sarah said, "but I need my desk." He blinked. "Your desk." "My desk, my ink bottles, my pens, the ledgers from the third shelf, north wall, behind the tax records, and the ceramic pot from my mother's workshop, the one sealed with beeswax. You want to bring your office supplies? I want to bring my work. It is who I am. I am not going to stop being a record keeper because a king tells me I am his mate." Kyle looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze. The silver of her new wolf eyes met the amber of his, and something passed between them that was not words, was not even really a feeling, but was more like two frequencies finding each other in static. "Pack the desk," Kyle said to the nearest guard, without breaking eye contact with Sarah. They left Thornmere at dusk. 3 covered wagons for the guard, 1 carriage for Kyle and Sarah, and a 4th wagon carrying Sarah's desk, her ink supplies, her ledgers, and a ceramic pot sealed with beeswax that hummed faintly when she held it. Sarah sat across from Kyle in the carriage. The seats were leather, worn soft by years of use, and they smelled like saddle oil and the faint ghost of tobacco from some previous occupant. The carriage rocked gently on the uneven road, and the motion made the lantern hanging from the ceiling beam swing, casting moving shadows that turned Kael's face into a shifting landscape of light and darkness. He had not touched her since the council hall. She could tell it was costing him something. His hands rested on his knees, and every few minutes his fingers would curl inward, nails pressing into his palms, and then deliberately relax. "How long have you been king?" she asked. 7 years. "Have you been looking for a mate that entire time?" "My wolf has. I stopped actively looking after the 3rd year. It was making me difficult. My general says unbearable." "And now?" He looked at her. In the shifting lantern light, his amber eyes seemed to pulse. "Now my wolf wants to mark you, and claim you, and make every wolf within 100 miles know that you belong to me. And the human part of me wants to ask if you are hungry, and whether you need a blanket, because you have not stopped shivering since we left." Sarah had not realized she was shivering. She had been cold for so long that the sensation had become background noise, like the hum of the ceramic pot or the permanent taste of ink on her tongue. He shrugged off his jacket and held it out, not draping it over her shoulders, not performing the gesture, just holding it and waiting. She took it. The lining was warm from his body, and when she pulled it around herself, his scent enveloped her, and her wolf pressed against her chest with a sound that was almost a purr. "I am hungry," she admitted. "I have been hungry for about 2 years." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not the performative fury of a man who wants to seem protective. Something quieter and more dangerous. The cold calculation of a man who was making a list. He reached under the seat and pulled out a leather satchel. Inside were provisions for travel: hard bread, dried venison, a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, and a canteen of water. Simple food. He laid it out on the seat beside her, with the precision of someone setting a table. Sarah ate. She ate slowly, because her stomach had shrunk, and she knew from experience that eating too fast after a period of deprivation would make her sick. The bread was dense and slightly sweet. The cheese was sharp enough to make her jaw ache. The venison was salted and chewy, and tasted like it had been smoked over applewood. Kael watched her eat, the way a person watches the first rain after a drought, with attention and something close to reverence. "You are staring," she said. "Yes. It is unsettling. I am aware. You are not going to stop, are you?" "No." She finished the bread and cheese and half the venison. Her stomach protested at the sudden fullness, but the protest was minor compared to the relief of having something solid inside her that was not parchment. "Tell me about the ink," Kael said. Sarah took a sip of water and considered how much to share. Caution was a habit so deeply embedded in her that it functioned like a second heartbeat, always running, always reminding her to keep things close. "My mother made it," she said. "She was the pack healer, but she was also something older. She knew plant lore that was not in any modern herbal. She mixed compounds that could heal wounds that should have been fatal. And she made the ceremonial ink, the ink used for official pack documents, using a recipe that had been passed through our family for generations. The ceramic pot. The ceramic pot contains a distillation. I do not fully understand the process. My mother died before she could teach me. But whatever is in that pot, it carries something of our bloodline. When I add it to the ink, the documents I write become more than paper and words. They become records of our family's existence, our signature, our proof. Proof of what? That the lunar bloodline survived." Kael leaned forward. The carriage lantern swung, and his shadow on the wall behind him was enormous, the shape of a man and the suggestion of something larger. "There are people who have been searching for the lunar bloodline for a very long time," he said. "Some of them want to restore it. Some of them want to end it. My visit to Thornmere was not coincidental. I received intelligence 6 months ago that someone in a small northern pack was producing documents with a chemical signature that matched ancient lunar artifacts. I came to find the source." "You came to find ink," Sarah said. "I came to find the person making the ink. I expected an old healer, a grandmother, maybe, guarding the last scraps of a dead tradition." He paused. "I did not expect a young woman with ink on her mouth and parchment in her stomach and a wolf that looked like it was made of starlight." "I am not made of starlight. I am made of exhaustion and bad posture and a chronic vitamin deficiency." He did something unexpected then. He laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was a short, startled sound, as if laughter was something that happened to him so rarely he was not entirely sure how to manage it. But it transformed his face. The scar on his jaw creased. Lines appeared at the corners of his eyes. For 2 seconds, he looked like a different person, someone who had existed before the crown and the wars and the weight of ruling the largest territory in the region. Then the laugh faded, and he was the Alpha King again, but the ghost of it lingered around his mouth. They arrived at the Central Territories at dawn on the 2nd day. The capital was called Ashenmoor, and it was nothing like Thornmere, where Thornmere was a valley settlement of wooden buildings and muddy paths. Ashenmoor was a city. Stone walls, paved streets, a castle that rose from the center of town like a clenched fist, dark stone and narrow windows, and a central tower that caught the first light and turned it the color of blood. Sarah stood in the courtyard and looked up at the castle and felt very small. "It is less intimidating inside," Kael said beside her. Mostly. The Great Hall has a mural of my great-grandfather, killing a bear with his bare hands. It is anatomically inaccurate and somewhat disturbing. You will get used to it." Inside, the castle was cold stone and warm wood, heavy tapestries and fireplaces large enough to stand in. Kael led her to a room on the 2nd floor of the east wing, and when he opened the door, Sarah stopped breathing. It was a library. Not a records room. Not a storage closet with shelves. An actual library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a rolling ladder and a desk, a proper desk, mahogany and brass, with drawers that slid smoothly and a surface wide enough to lay out 3 documents side by side. There was a window that took up most of the south wall, letting in a flood of pale morning light, and the air smelled like paper and leather and the faint vanilla sweetness of old glue. "This was my mother's study," Kael said. "She was the last Luna of the Central Territories. She died when I was 12. Sarah touched the surface of the desk. The wood was warm under her fingers. There were faint scratches in the surface, the kind made by pen nibs, and in the upper right corner, someone had carved a small symbol into the wood. Sarah's breath caught. She knew that symbol. It was the same one on her mother's ceramic pot. "They knew each other," Sarah said. "Our mothers." Kael stood in the doorway. He was watching her the way he had watched her eat, with that quiet, ravenous attention. "Is this an acceptable workspace?" he asked. Sarah pressed her palm flat against the carved symbol and felt the desk hum under her hand, the same way the ceramic pot hummed. A frequency, a recognition. "Yes," she said. "This is acceptable." The first week was a careful dance of proximity and restraint. Kael gave her space. He did not push. He appeared at her door in the morning with coffee and bread, and left when she told him she needed to work. He appeared again at lunch, and again at dinner. He was predictable in his appearances, and unpredictable in his patience, because Sarah had expected a possessive alpha to push for marking within the first day, and Kael had not mentioned it once. What he did instead was bring her things. Not gifts, exactly. Things. A box of high-quality iron sulfate for her ink, sourced from a supplier in the Western Territories. A set of calligraphy pens with interchangeable nibs, the kind she had seen in catalogues, but never been able to afford. A pair of reading glasses with delicate gold frames, because he had noticed her squinting at small text, and had apparently had her vision assessed by the castle physician, without telling her. "You are courting me with office supplies," she said on the 4th day, holding up the reading glasses. "Is it working?" "It is disturbingly effective." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the one that was too small for him, but that he folded himself into anyway, and he read through reports while she worked on her ledgers. They spent hours like this, in a silence that was not empty, but full, dense with the awareness of each other's presence, the sound of breathing, the scratch of pens, the occasional rustle of paper. On the 6th day, Sarah opened her mother's ceramic pot for the first time in the castle library. The scent that rose from it was different here. In Thornmere, it had smelled like herbs and rain and something mineral and deep. Here, in a room that had belonged to another Luna, it smelled like that and more. It smelled like connection, like 2 threads of the same tapestry, finding each other after being separated. Kael, who had been reading on the other side of the room, stood up abruptly. His chair scraped against the stone floor. "What is that?" he said. "The distillation. From the pot." He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood over the desk, looking down at the open ceramic container. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, with an oily sheen that caught the light and turned it iridescent, like the surface of a raven's wing. "It smells like you," he said, "but more." More what? More everything. He was standing very close. His hand was on the edge of the desk, and his knuckles were white. His wolf was close again. She could see it in the way his eyes had gone bright amber, and his breathing had changed, deeper and more controlled, the measured breathing of a man fighting to maintain composure. "Kael," He closed his eyes. Yes. You have been very patient. I have been extremely patient. My general would say suspiciously patient. Why? He opened his eyes. Because you spent 9 years being told you were nothing, being treated as a thing to be used and discarded. If I had pushed, if I had claimed you the way my wolf wanted to on the first day, I would have been doing the same thing, taking your choices, telling you what you are. He paused. I want you to tell me what you are. Sarah looked at him, at the scar on his jaw, and the amber eyes and the controlled tremor in his hands, and the way he had folded his enormous body into a small chair for 6 days just to be near her while she worked. I am a record keeper, she said. Yes, I am a lunar bloodline wolf whose eyes turn silver. Yes, I am a woman who ate an exile decree and cited a legal precedent from 1847 to a man who wanted to destroy me. Yes, and I am your mate. The sound he made was not human. It came from his chest, from the place where his wolf lived, and it was a sound of release, of something held under tremendous pressure finally being allowed to exist. He reached for her, and she reached back, and the moment their hands connected, Sarah's wolf did not just wake up. It shifted. The transformation was nothing like what she had feared at 14. There was no violence, no bone-cracking agony. It was warm. It was right. It felt like stepping into a body that had always been waiting for her. She felt her bones rearrange, felt fur push through her skin like grass through soil, felt her senses explode outward in every direction. The room became a symphony of scent and sound. She could smell the glue in the book bindings, and the iron in the ink, and the centuries of dust in the tapestries, and Kael everywhere, cedar and smoke and berries, and underneath it all, the deep, resonant frequency of an alpha wolf recognizing its Luna. She was silver. She could see it in the reflection of the window glass. A wolf that was smaller than Kael's would be, but luminous, her fur the color of moonlight, her eyes 2 points of metallic light. Kael shifted to meet her. His wolf was black, enormous, with amber eyes that looked at her silver form the way a planet looks at its sun. He pressed his forehead against hers, and their wolves breathed together, and the bond between them solidified into something Sarah could almost see, a thread of light connecting them chest to chest. They shifted back. They were kneeling on the library floor, surrounded by fallen papers and overturned ink bottles, and Sarah was shaking, not from cold or fear, but from the sheer overwhelming sensation of being, for the first time in her life, completely and undeniably present in her own body. I ruined the ink, she said, looking at the dark stain spreading across the floor. Kael laughed. The real laugh, the startled one that transformed his face. I will buy you more ink. It is very expensive ink. I am a king. I can afford ink. She kissed him. She did not plan it. She was not a person who did things impulsively. She was a record keeper, a cataloguer, a woman who cited subsection 8 of founding documents. But she leaned forward and pressed her mouth against his, and she tasted ink, her own ink, on his lips. The same oak gall and iron sulfate and mysterious distillation that she had been swallowing from the Exile decree, the same chemical signature that had called his wolf from 3 days' travel away. It was on his mouth, because he had touched the parchment, because he had brought his fingers to his lips without thinking, because some part of him had been tasting her for months, every time he handled a document that bore her work. He made that sound again, the one from his chest, and his hands came up to frame her face. And he kissed her back with a tenderness that should not have been possible for a man his size. his lips moving against hers with a careful precision that told her he was holding back, that the full force of what he wanted to do would overwhelm them both. The kiss tasted like ink and cedar and the ghost of blackberries. Sarah decided it was the best thing she had ever tasted, better than the sharp cheese, better than the applewood venison, better than anything she had eaten in her years of hunger. "I need to tell you something," she said against his mouth. "Tell me." "There are people coming. The intelligence you received about the chemical signature in the documents. You found it, but you were not the only one looking." He pulled back. The tenderness in his expression did not vanish, but it was joined by something harder, the strategic mind of a king receiving battlefield intelligence. "How do you know?" "Because I am a record keeper. I read every piece of correspondence that passes through a PAC's administrative offices. 3 months ago, Corwin received a letter with a seal I did not recognize. A black wolf on a red field. He burned it after reading it, but I saw it first. I have a very good memory. What did it say? It offered a price for the location of any wolf carrying the lunar bloodline marker. The price was territory. Half the northern region in exchange for one name." Kael's eyes went cold. Not the productive cold of anger, but the flat, absolute cold of a man who has identified a threat and is already calculating the most efficient way to eliminate it. "The Blackthorn Pact," he said. "You know them. They have been trying to eliminate the lunar bloodline for 2 generations. They believe the lunar's power is an affront to the natural order. They want all wolves governed by brute strength, not the old magic. Then they are going to come here. Because Corwin did not burn that letter fast enough, and I am no longer hidden in a records room in the middle of nowhere. I am in the Alpha King's castle, and if they have agents in your territory, they already know." The playfulness drained from his face. He stood, and the transition from the man who laughed at spilled ink to the king, who commanded the largest army in the territories, was so abrupt it was like watching weather change on a mountain. "How long do we have?" Sarah thought about the letter, the date, the language, the urgency in the phrasing. Her ability to process information and find patterns, the one useful trait Corwin had identified, turned now to a different kind of calculation. "Days," she said. "Maybe less." He pulled her to her feet. His hands were steady now, the tremor of restrained desire replaced by the solidity of a man preparing for war. "Then we have work to do." The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. Kael mobilized his guard, sent scouts to the borders, and convened his war council in the great hall beneath the anatomically inaccurate bear-killing mural. Sarah sat at the council table with her ledgers and her pens and the ceramic pot, and the Alpha King's generals looked at her the way people look at a stray cat that has somehow ended up at the head of the dinner table. But they listened, because Sarah knew things. 9 years of reading every document that passed through a PAC's administration had given her a comprehensive knowledge of territorial politics, alliance structures, supply chains, and communication networks that no intelligence officer could match. She knew which PACs had trade disputes. She knew which border territories were undermanned. She knew, from a footnote in a supply requisition from 2 years ago, that the Eastern Pass could not support heavy troop movement during spring thaw because the bridge at Renford had been repaired with substandard timber. "The Blackthorn will come through the Eastern Pass," she told the War Council, "not because it is the best route, but because it is the one their commander knows." General Haskell served in the Eastern Garrison before his defection. He mapped the terrain personally. "He will use familiar ground." Kael's general, a grey-haired woman named Torren with a face like weathered stone and a voice like gravel in a tin can, looked at Sarah with an expression of grudging respect. "How do you know Haskell's service record?" Torrin asked. "He was mentioned in a disciplinary report I catalogued in my 3rd year. Insubordination charge, Eastern Garrison, dismissed on appeal." The report included a detailed description of the terrain assessment he submitted as evidence in his defense. "I remember the assessment." "You remember a terrain assessment from 6 years ago?" "I remember everything I read." Torrin looked at Kyle. "Where has she been all this time?" "In a closet," Kyle said, and his voice carried a weight that made the entire table go quiet. The attack came on the 3rd night. It came exactly where Sarah said it would, through the Eastern Pass, across the Renford Bridge. And the bridge held, because Kyle had sent engineers to reinforce it, not to help the enemy cross, but to ensure it would support the weight of the explosive charges his sappers had planted beneath it. The Blackthorn Pact sent 80 wolves through the pass. When the front 30 crossed the bridge, the charges detonated, and the bridge collapsed into the river gorge with a sound like the earth cracking open. 30 wolves went into the water. The remaining 50 were trapped on the far side of the gorge, with no way across and Kyle's archers on the ridge above. It should have been over. It would have been over, if not for the wolves who were already inside the castle. There were 3 of them. They had entered Ashenmoor as merchants a week earlier, before Kyle's return, and they had been living in the commercial district, selling leather goods and keeping their wolves carefully suppressed. They moved through the castle during the battle, when most of the guard was deployed to the Eastern Pass, and they found Sarah in the library. She heard them before she saw them. 3 sets of footsteps in the corridor, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of people who are trying to be quiet but are not accustomed to stone floors. She heard the creak of leather, the soft click of a knife being drawn from a sheath, and the quickened breathing of people who are about to do something violent. She closed the ceramic pot. She capped her ink. She placed her pen precisely in the center of her desk, nib down in the ceramic cup. Then she stood and faced the door. The first wolf through was a woman. Tall, rangy, with close-cropped brown hair, and the lean, hungry look of someone who lived hard. She carried a long knife in her right hand and a length of rope in her left. "Lunar bloodline," the woman said, and the way she said it, the flat contempt, reminded Sarah of the way Corwin used to say, "Omega," like it was a diagnosis. "You are coming with us." "I am not," Sarah said. The second wolf entered. A man, shorter than the woman, with a shaved head and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. The third followed, another man, taller, with the careful movements of someone trained in combat. 3 against 1. And Sarah's wolf, newly awakened, was untested, unpracticed. She had shifted exactly once, in a library, surrounded by books and spilled ink. But she had something else. She had the ceramic pot. Sarah did not fully understand what she did next. The knowledge came from somewhere beneath conscious thought, from a place that her mother had built and sealed and left dormant, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. She reached behind her, uncapped the pot without looking, and dipped her fingers into the dark, iridescent liquid. The ink responded to her touch the way fire responds to gasoline. It climbed her hand, her wrist, her forearm. Not hot, not cold, but alive. It moved with purpose, flowing along the lines of her veins like a second circulatory system becoming visible. The symbols that had been invisible before, the ones she had never been able to read, appeared on her skin in dark, flowing lines, spiraling from her fingertips to her shoulders. The female assassin took a step back. Her knife hand wavered. "What are you doing?" she said. Sarah did not answer. She pressed her ink-stained palms flat on the desk, and the mahogany surface lit up. The carved symbol in the corner blazed, and from it lines of light spread outward like cracks in ice, racing across the desk, down the legs, across the floor, up the walls. The library came alive. Every book, every shelf, every page of every document that had been written in lunar ink over the centuries began to glow with a soft silver light that pulsed in time with Sarah's heartbeat. The light was not aggressive. It did not burn or cut or explode. It simply made things visible, and what it made visible, to Sarah and to everyone in the room, was the truth. The female assassin's knife clattered to the floor, not because the light disarmed her, because the light showed her something she had kept buried. The memory of a child, a daughter, taken from her by the Blackthorn Pact as leverage, held somewhere Sarah could see in the light as clearly as reading words on a page, a small stone building in the southern marshes, a girl of maybe 7, drawing wolves in the dirt with a stick. "Mira," the woman said, and her voice broke on the name the way a dam breaks on a river, all at once and completely. The other 2 assassins looked at their companion, and they saw what the light showed them, too. The bald man saw his brother, dead in a border skirmish he had been told was necessary, but that the light revealed was a diversion, a sacrifice of expendable troops to cover a supply raid. The tall man saw his own face, younger, before the Blackthorn Pact, before the ideology and the violence, sitting in a garden with a book of poetry and a glass of wine. The light did not judge. It revealed. And revelation, Sarah understood now, was its own kind of weapon. The woman sank to her knees. She did not look away from the image of her daughter. Tears ran down her face and dripped off her jaw onto the stone floor, and she made no effort to wipe them away. "Where is she?" the woman asked. "The image, the building, where is that?" "Southern marshes," Sarah said. "Third inlet, past the willow brake. Stone building with a red door. You can see that clearly?" "I can read it. It is written in light. Everything true is written somewhere." The woman looked at her companions. The bald man put his knife away. The tall man looked at his hands, at the poetry-reading ghost of himself that the light had shown him, and he looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to step forward or back. "We were sent to take you," the woman said, "to deliver you to General Haskell." "I know. If we do not, he will kill Mira." "He will try," Sarah said. "But the Alpha King has already sent a unit to the southern marshes. I told him about the hostage locations 2 days ago. I found them in the intercepted correspondence." The woman stared at her. "You read the correspondence?" "I read everything. I am a record keeper." Kael found them like that. He came through the library door with blood on his forearm, and his wolf so close to the surface that his eyes were molten gold, and he saw 3 Blackthorn assassins on the floor of his dead mother's library, and his mate standing behind the desk with ink flowing up her arms, and the room filled with silver light. He stopped. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the light. He looked at the symbols on her skin, and the blazing desk, and the assassins who were weeping on the floor of his library. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "What happened?" "I showed them the truth." He crossed the room. The 3 assassins flinched as he passed, but he did not look at them. He walked to Sarah and took her ink-stained hands in his, and the symbols on her skin flickered at his touch and then steadied, growing brighter, as if his presence amplified whatever frequency they operated on. "The bridge worked," he said. "Haskell's main force is scattered. We captured 47 wolves and killed 9. Haskell escaped into the forest, but Torin has trackers on his trail. And the southern marshes. My unit reached the hostage site an hour ago. 7 people rescued, including a child." The woman on the floor made a sound that was halfway between a scream and a prayer. Kyle looked at her, and in that look, Sarah saw the calculation of a king weighing mercy against security, the cold mathematics of power, and she saw the moment the calculation tipped, not toward cruelty but toward something more complex. "The child is safe," he told the woman. "She drew wolves in the dirt while she waited. My soldiers said she was remarkably calm." The woman pressed her forehead to the floor and sobbed. The next morning, the council gathered. Not the Thornmere Council, with its unauthorized beta and its cowardly elders. The proper council, the full territorial assembly, representatives from every pack in the Central Territories, gathered in the great hall beneath the anatomically inaccurate bear mural. Sarah stood beside Kyle at the head of the hall. She had bathed for the first time in something other than a bucket of cold water, and the experience had been so disorienting that she had sat in the warm water for 20 minutes before she remembered to actually wash. She wore clothes that fit, a deep blue dress that someone had tailored overnight, because Kyle had apparently woken a seamstress at 3 in the morning with the quiet intensity of a man who would not accept that clothing alterations could not be done in 6 hours. Her hair was clean and unbound, and fell past her shoulders in dark waves. The scar on her forearm was visible below the sleeve, and she had not tried to hide it. The ink stains on her fingertips were permanent, the blue-black badge of her profession, and she wore them the way a soldier wears campaign ribbons. "This is Sarah Thorne," Kyle said to the assembled wolves. His voice carried the particular resonance of an alpha addressing his people, the harmonic frequency that you did not hear so much as feel in your sternum. "She is a record keeper. She is a lunar bloodline wolf. She is my mate." The hall was silent. "She will serve as Luna of the Central Territories. She will also continue to serve as the keeper of territorial records, because she has informed me, repeatedly and at length, that being a queen does not excuse her from proper documentation procedures." A murmur of something that might have been amusement rippled through the hall. "If anyone objects to this arrangement," Kyle said, "you may take the matter up with her. She will cite a legal precedent from the appropriate century and tell you exactly which subsection of which founding document renders your objection invalid. I have found this more effective than threats of violence." Sarah looked at him. "That is not entirely true. You also threatened violence." "I threatened violence as a supplementary measure. You told Beta Corwin you would remove his spine through his nostrils. That was motivational communication." The hall's murmur became an unmistakable ripple of laughter. Not the nervous laughter of wolves afraid to displease their king. Real laughter. The sound of people watching two people who fit together in a way that was unexpected and undeniable. Elder Torren, who had been standing at the edge of the hall with her arms crossed and her face in its default expression of granite disapproval, uncrossed her arms and gave a single, decisive nod. The marking ceremony was held at dusk, not in the great hall, but in the library, because Sarah had refused the traditional location, and Kyle had stopped pretending that he would deny her anything approximately 4 days earlier. They stood between the shelves. The silver light was gone from the walls, but it lingered in the desk, a faint luminescence in the carved symbol that pulsed like a heartbeat. The ceramic pot was open on the desk, and its scent filled the room. Herbs and rain and mineral depth, and something new, something that smelled like the future, if the future had a scent, warm and unwritten and full of possibility. "This will hurt," Kyle said. "Briefly. I ate a legal document. I can handle a bite." He laughed. The real laugh. And then he pulled her close, one arm around her waist, his other hand cradling the back of her head, tilting her neck to the side. She felt his breath against her skin, warm and unsteady, and she realized he was nervous. The Alpha King of the Central Territories, the man who had detonated a bridge and scattered an army, and terrified a beta into confession with a look, was nervous about hurting her. Kael. Yes. I am not fragile. I know. Then stop treating me like I am parchment. He bit. His teeth broke the skin at the junction of her neck and shoulder, and the pain was sharp and bright and gone almost instantly, replaced by something that was not pain at all, but its opposite, a flood of warmth that started at the bite and radiated outward through her entire body. She felt the bond lock into place, a physical sensation like a key turning in a lock, a mechanism clicking from open to closed, from temporary to permanent. Her wolf surged, and the silver light erupted from the desk and from her skin, and from the carved symbol on the wood, filling the library with a luminescence that turned every book on every shelf into a glowing tablet of compressed light. The knowledge in the room, centuries of records and stories and legal documents and love letters and death certificates, and all the accumulated paper evidence of wolves living and dying and falling in love and making terrible mistakes and occasionally, getting it right. All of it blazed for a moment, visible, known, recorded. Kael held her through it. His arms were steady. His heartbeat against her back was the deep, measured rhythm she had come to associate with safety. The bass note of a frequency she now understood was not just his. It was theirs. The light faded. The library settled back into its ordinary beauty, books and dust and warm light through old glass. Sarah pressed her hand to the mark on her neck. It was warm to the touch, slightly raised, and when she looked at her reflection in the window glass, she could see it, two crescent impressions framed by a faint silver tracery that followed the lines of her veins. "You are mine," Kael said against her hair. Not possessive, not demanding, stating a fact, recording it, making it official. "And you," Sarah said, turning in his arms to face him, touching the scar on his jaw, the tired lines at the corners of his amber eyes, the mouth that smiled so rarely and meant it every time, "are mine." He kissed her. She tasted ink, not the bitter chemical ink of the Exile decree she had swallowed in desperation on a cold stone floor. This was different. This was her ink, the ink she had mixed with her mother's distillation, the ink that carried the lunar bloodline, the ink that had called him across 3 days of travel to a records room in a forgotten pack. It was on his lips because it was in his blood now, the same way she was in his blood, permanent as a tattoo, indelible as a signature. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I am going to reorganize your territorial records. They are in appalling condition. Your filing system appears to have been designed by someone who was actively hostile toward alphabetical order." He pressed his forehead against hers. "Whatever you want. I also need a bigger desk." 3 months later, in the library that had become her office and her kingdom, and the place where the Alpha King of the Central Territories could most reliably be found, sitting in a chair too small for him, reading reports while his Luna worked, Sarah opened a ledger and began to write. She wrote in ink she had mixed herself, from the same recipe her mother had used, with the same distillation from the same ceramic pot, now replenished with ingredients she had learned to prepare in the weeks since her wolf awakened. The ink flowed from her pen in clean, precise lines, dark and permanent, carrying within its chemical structure a signature that was uniquely hers. She wrote the date. She wrote the location. She wrote the names of the wolves present, and the business conducted, and the decisions made. She recorded, as she had always recorded, the facts of the world as they existed, without embellishment, without omission, without judgment. Then she turned to a fresh page, and she wrote one additional entry in the small, careful handwriting that had become as recognizable in the Central Territories as the King's seal. Birth registration. Projected date. Approximately 7 months from the current entry. 1 child. Lineage listed as lunar bloodline. Direct descent. Confirmed silver marker. She set her pen down and placed both hands flat on the desk. The carved symbol pulsed under her right palm. Her wolf, fully present now, fully awake, pressed against her chest with a warmth that was becoming familiar. And lower, beneath the warmth of her wolf, a second warmth, newer, smaller, steadier. Kyle looked up from his reports. He always knew when she stopped writing. The silence of her working and the silence of her not working were different frequencies, and he heard both. "What did you write?" he asked. She slid the ledger across the desk. He picked it up, and she watched his eyes move across the entry, watched the moment the meaning hit him, watched the progression from confusion to comprehension, to something that dismantled his entire face. Every wall and barrier, and carefully maintained expression, collapsing at once to reveal the raw, unguarded man underneath. He looked at her. His eyes were bright. His mouth was open. He looked like a man who had been handed something he had not known he was missing. "You are sure?" he whispered. "I am a record keeper," she said. "I do not write things I am not sure of." He came around the desk. He knelt in front of her chair, which put his face level with hers, and he placed his hands on her waist with a care that bordered on reverence, and he pressed his forehead against her stomach, against the place where the second warmth lived. "I will protect you," he said into the fabric of her dress. "Both of you. Always." "I know," she said, and she ran her fingers through his dark hair, and the light from the south-facing window fell across them both in a warm, even glow, and the ink dried on the page.